Puss in Boots: The Last Wish came out about a year ago, but DreamWorks really hasn't made anything worth talking about since then. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down why it was so good and what DreamWorks actually got right. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you all for the recent support, and if you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe as it helps a lot. Anyways, to start, we should talk about the animation. It's the first thing you notice when watching this movie, and for good reason. It uses a blend of 2D and 3D animation, switching between 12 and 24 frames a second, giving it a choppy effect that helps with the timing of the scene. Before this movie, DreamWorks has been pretty consistent with their animation style, varying only a bit from year to year, but this is the movie that changed that. After the success of Into the Spider-Verse, many studios began to adopt the style because of how visually appealing it is. The reason that this style is so good is that it gives the animators certain freedoms that they otherwise wouldn't have. Even in the first few scenes, we see amazing choreography that carries the fights, which carries on throughout the movie. A lot of things the animators do are really subtle, but still manage to make the animation so much better. The whole movie is elevated because this style lets the animators express themselves in ways that they couldn't otherwise, and a really good example of this is many of the scenes that have death in them. By red-scaling the backgrounds, we're shown fear, which helps the already vivid feeling that the rest of the scene brings us. It's not necessary, but still brings another layer that can be appreciated. When this style of animation is paired with people who understand it, we get amazing scenes that really come together. There's something that could be talked about in almost every scene, but it's not just the animation that makes this movie so good. Even though the animation is amazing, and all of these things let us play into the story better, without the story itself, the animation wouldn't matter. When the movie started, we were immediately told that's a fairy tale, and where a lot of modern movies would call this out or use it for a one-off joke, The Last Wish plays into it. It understands that this isn't necessary, and someone would think that this makes sense. But if you've watched animated movies recently, you'd understand that this is kind of surprising. Pretty soon after this, we're introduced to Puss in Boots. And what's important here is that we're actually introduced to him. Even though this movie is technically a sequel, it introduces the characters like it's our first time seeing them, because it is for a lot of people. Even though it's an old character, it has a lot of new viewers, which the producers understand. During his introduction, we're shown that Puss in Boots is a self-proclaimed fearless hero, something that's immediately backed up. But obviously, if this was 100% true, we wouldn't have a plot. Now that we've established our character, we need an event that changes his status quo. After meeting with the barber doctor, Puss finds out that of his 9 lives, he only has 1 left. What I like about this scene is that it doesn't immediately change anything. It sets us up for a conflict, but doesn't force us into it. And when the doctor asks him if he has anyone close, it's only hinted at that he doesn't. The reason that I mention this specifically is that unlike a lot of movies that have come out recently, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish understands subtlety. This is where the movie really starts, as now that we have the cause, it's only a matter of time before we have an effect. In the very next scene, Puss is in a bar, and he hasn't yet processed his newfound mortality. And before he's given a chance, we're introduced to our first villain, Death. What I love about his introduction is its pacing. It's not immediately clear what his intentions are, but his aura is incredibly present. His sudden appearance is contrasted by his slow build-up, which allows the time to set the scene that really sets him apart. When they do eventually fight, Puss in Boots feels fear for the first time, and we're not yet told who Death is, but at this point in the story, it doesn't really matter. What's important is that he's a threat and that he's changed the status quo. At this point, he's only been on screen for about a minute, but he definitely has enough impact to make up for that. During the fight, Puss loses his sword, which kind of symbolizes part of his identity. When he runs away, he begins to accept that he has a genuine fear of dying, which directly goes against the character that we were introduced to. At this point in the story, he's being broken down, but he hasn't yet reached his lowest point. While he sinks lower, we're introduced to our second antagonist, Goldilocks. She isn't meant to be as intimidating as Death, but she still does an amazing job working against Puss and furthering the story. She has an amazing voice actor, and her introduction is pretty much perfect, so my only complaint really is that we don't get to see her for long enough. Before we really see enough of her, we go back to Puss. he's going to the place recommended by the doctor, which is basically just a sad retirement home, where he meets Perro, a dog pretending to be a cat that he finds very annoying. I'm not gonna lie, when I was watching the movie for the first time, I thought that this was where it was gonna start falling apart. But some way, somehow, the annoying sidekick isn't that bad. And while there are some scenes that I don't like, he never does anything that takes away from the emotional moments, and in fact, he adds to them. The humor isn't exactly my taste, but that's not really a problem because it never takes the center stage. They kind of have a Donkey-Shrek relationship where Puss slowly learns to be friends with him, and it's never overdone, actually making sense to Puss's character and his story. His whole character arc is about learning to rely on people, and if Perro wasn't in the story, his character arc wouldn't be as impactful. Once Puss begins to reach his lowest point, the house is broken into by Goldilocks, and we find out that she is looking to hire him to steal the wishing star. During the scene, Goldilocks holds him up, but she doesn't recognize him as the legend that he once was. The importance of this scene is that Puss doesn't really see himself as the legend either, as how he looks begins to reflect how he feels. It shows us how far he's fallen, and is the first scene where we see the bears and Goldilocks in action, and begin to learn about their dynamic. At this point in the movie, we have enough antagonists, but there's still room for one more. The third and final villain, Big Jack Horner, is amazing. When he's introduced, we're given suffocating shots where he takes up more than the whole frame, letting us understand that he is in fact big. When Puss in Boots sneaks through his lair, we learn that he collects magic items, and his goal is to get more. Through his actions, we quickly learn that he's very selfish and will do almost anything to gain power. While Goldilocks is an antagonist, Jack Horner is a villain. We're really shown the point that without justification, he's evil and he enjoys being evil. We're not meant to sympathize with him in any way, and the movie never tries to make us. His origin is a little bit silly, but his motives are incredibly clear, which makes him so effective as a villain. His introduction makes perfect sense, and from the moment we first see him, we understand why he's in the story. While we're introduced to Jack Horner, Puss is sneaking into his lair. When Puss finally gets to the chest, we're introduced to Kitty Softpaws, the love interest, and more importantly, the only other character who can be a judge of Puss in Boots other than himself. She's the only one who truly knows him and probably understands him more than he does himself. Throughout the scene, we learn a lot about their dynamic and find out a lot of things about Puss that we otherwise wouldn't know. The two of them end up escaping together, and for the first time in the movie, we see that Puss is being held to the standards of someone other than himself. She's the first person that's similar to him in any way, and because of this, she provides some amazing parallels that are explored later in the movie. I haven't really seen too many people talk about her, which is really surprising because in a lot of the scenes, it's her who embodies fearlessness, which is supposed to be the signature of Puss in Boots. And to me, it seems like her purpose in the story is to contrast Puss and show us that he's really lost part of his identity. While they're escaping, we see that Puss acts very carefully while Kitty runs in headfirst, continuing to embody the person that Puss once was. While the group escapes, we see Death for the second time, standing in a crowd and staring down Puss. This is when we're reminded that the closer Puss gets to his old life, the closer he gets to death. And that even though he's adventuring again, he still carries the same fear that he learned back at the bar. Before we're given a chance to process this, we reach the Dark Forest, the home of the Wishing Star. The entrance to the forest is a black veil with no way to tell what's on the other side. If we look at this from a storytelling perspective, this works as two things. First, it acts as the unknown world from the hero's journey, but it's also a device to show us through Puss's actions that he really has changed. That instead of being fearless, he's careful, worrying about what lies ahead, taking as much precaution as possible. While Kitty doesn't fear the unknown and enters first, Puss now fears what lies ahead. But while the group continue to get closer to the star, they're being followed by Jack Horner and Goldilocks, and as these two get closer, we get to learn more about them. We find out that Goldilocks is hiding something, and that Jack Horner disregards human life like it's nothing. We also find out about Kitty and Puss's past, learning that something separated them, and that Kitty still doesn't trust him for it. Despite this though, she wants to, but doesn't know if she can. As the villains get closer, Kitty gives Puss her dagger, showing the first piece of trust that she gives up, as before this, he didn't have a weapon. During the battle, we continue to see how fearless Kitty is, in contrast to Puss, who is unable to stay composed. When Jack Horner's men begin to perish, we see death for the third time. This follows the theory that death only appears when death is present, as the first time he appears, the bartender is not seen again, and the second time is when someone is turned to gold. This time, the wolf doesn't chase after him, but the essence of the chase is still there. As Puss begins to remember the fear that he experienced, he runs deeper into the forest and sees visions, and has was, unironically, one of the best depictions of a panic attack that I've ever seen. I love this scene for so many reasons, but my favorite part about it is how realistic it is. From the heartbeats to the camera work, they truly did an amazing job. There is danger present in the scene, but what Puss feels is purely psychological. His fear of death manifesting itself to the point where we don't really know if his visions are symbolic or literal. Like if you told me at this point that the wolf wasn't real and was just Puss's mental depiction of his fear, that would make sense to me, or at least that's how I see it. The whole battle is choreographed amazingly, but the cherry on top is that when Puss breaks down in the forest, Perro doesn't overstep. That for how goofy of a character he is, he understands what's happening and takes it seriously. Moments like this aren't just rare, but they're almost unheard of. After his breakdown, Puss admits for the first time that he's afraid. When he opens up, we learn more about his past, and when Kitty overhears that he regrets what he did, we visibly see the conflict in her mind and how she wants to be able to forgive him. And she does so in a way that doesn't overstep any boundaries, showing just how mature this movie can be. While we get closer to the star, tensions begin to rise, not only for Puss, but for Goldilocks and for Jack. We begin to find out what Goldilocks is hiding, and we're really forced to sympathize with the bears, even though they're the antagonists, because despite this, they're still a family. Her relationship with the bears is never really at the forefront of the story, but as the third most important antagonist, I'm happy that they chose to approach her story in the way they did. The movie doesn't need two Jack Horners, so even though she ends up being redeemed, it doesn't take away from any of the tension. Something else I love about her arc is that when the bears first find out that her wish was going to be for a new family, they decide to help her. It subverted my expectations more than almost anything else in the movie, and just shows how hard the emotional beats really hit. It's something that I really wasn't expecting from DreamWorks, and is one of the reasons I made this video to begin with. But going back to Puss, he's trapped in a crystal cave where he could speak with all of his past lives, and he begins to grapple with who he was and who he wants to be. The scene kind of feels like someone grappling with their past, asking themselves if they could still change despite all they've been through. I can't really put into words what these scenes make me feel, but I think they represent when Puss really begins to understand who he wants to be, even if he hasn't made the decision yet. And when it feels like he's finally going to make that breakthrough, death appears for the fourth time. And this time, he's here for Puss. Puss runs away as the scenery goes red, and we finally get the confirmation that the wolf is no bounty hunter, no normal villain, that he's death, straight up. Once again, Puss runs. He still has the fear that overpowers all other emotions, and even though he doesn't want to betray Kitty and Perro, his friendship with them isn't stronger than his fear of dying. He tries to defend running away, saying that he's changed, but obviously that change isn't complete. When Kitty tells him that he's still Puss in Boots, he says that he's not. And this is true in a way, because he sees Puss in Boots as someone who's fearless and heroic. But to Kitty, Puss in Boots is someone who's selfish and cares more about his legacy than anyone else. As they argue, the fight begins. This is where Goldilocks' arc is finished, and Jack Horner is built up to be the one true villain. But obviously, if Jack Horner was the big bad and not Death, that wouldn't make for a good ending. We waste no time dealing with Jack, and he's shoved into his magic bag so we could deal with him later. And on cue, Death arrives for the fifth and final time. But this time, it's different. Puss in Boots is given a choice. He has the map and can wish for all of his lives back, or he could fight. The first time Death fought him, all 8 of his past lives flashed before him, but this time, it's only 1. In a perfect callback to the beginning, he tells Death, "Fear me if you dare," but this time, he means it. During the fight, he loses his sword again, but this time, he has the dagger that Kitty gave him, showing us that he no longer fights alone and has someone by his side. The final fight parallels the beginning of the movie in many ways, but my favorite has to be when Death loses his sickle, and Puss, without hesitation, kicks it right back to him. It's one of the most iconic moments in the movie, and for good reason. We're shown that Puss has made his choice, and that he truly understands it. He's no longer the person who Death came for, and although he can't beat him, he can beat his fear of it, winning the battle through acceptance. The payoff we get to this is the final battle against Jack Horner, which doesn't have high stakes, but shows us that the new Puss in Boots, who's come to be throughout the movie, no longer acts in his old ways, working with Kitty to beat him. The main group easily defeat Jack Horner, giving us one of the cleanest conclusions to any DreamWorks movie. Unlike a lot of movies that have come out recently, every part of Puss in Boots seems intentional. From character designs to scenery, it truly seems like care was put into this movie. It's not often that animation studios grant the creative freedoms for pieces like this, but I think I speak for us all when I say it should happen more. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is probably the best DreamWorks movie to come out in the last 5 years, and I think it deserves to be talked about more. If you enjoyed this video or want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe. Anyways, that's all for now.